Dear God, we ask that we might recognize your presence among us as we consider holy things today. So the story goes pretty much this way. The journey from Baal, Judah to Jerusalem was about 20 miles over rocky terrain. The royal party moved slowly through the hills of Judah, traveling eastward. And the purpose of the expedition was to relocate the Ark of the Hebrew God. Remember the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark? They were transporting the oldest symbol of God's presence known to Jerusalem. David's a king now, and he had just taken possession of the city, which was a Canaanite high place. Without shedding a drop of blood, David had made this his capital, Jerusalem. It was a brilliant stroke of diplomacy. We saw one of those this week. Had he made any particular Hebrew city his capital, he would have been accused of favoring a specific tribe of Israelites. But now, by bringing the ark to the neutral ground of Jerusalem, he was marking his new political center as a religious center as well. The ark was a portable shrine in the form of a rectangular box made of acacia wood overlaid with gold, and on either side of the ark were poles inserted through rings, enabling the ark to be carried without being touched. A very important accessory, it turns out. On top of the ark was a slab of gold called the mercy seat, and at each end of the mercy seat there was a golden cherub with outstretched wings. Most important was the fact that the ark was considered to be the base on which sat the throne of God. It was supposed that God dwelt there, invisibly present on the mercy seat like a ruler on a throne. Wherever the ark was, there was God. So with extreme care, this ark was placed on a brand new ox cart and made its way uphill to the city. The traffic was unusually heavy that particular day. The ark was surrounded by the king's royal entourage, of course. There were plenty of military and also royal musicians, as well as a huge crowd of onlookers. Directly after making a hard turn, the moving party crossed a deeply rutted section of road made into a washboard by the kind of rain we see here in Oregon sometimes in the spring. It made the ark chatter, bumping up and down on the roadbed, slipping a little as it moved. Well, one member of the royal priesthood, whose name was Uzzah, moved by sheer instinct, reached out his hand to steady the ark just to keep it from jumping out of the wagon. No one knows exactly what happened next. Some claim to have seen a flash of something like lightning reach between Uzzah and the box of God. Another witness said that Uzzah had been breathing heavily moments before the commotion. He may have inadvertently brushed against the ark, but was seen then clutching his chest before falling to the ground in a heap. Either way, efforts to revive him failed. The cause of death was listed as act of God. The coroner's inquest determined that God had struck Uzzah down because he had reached out with human hands to steady the holiest symbol of God's presence on earth, making it kind of a disturbing story. The text, in fact, in our lectionary about the ark skips these verses about Uzzah very neatly. You can hardly see a seam here if you read it that way. The gap in the lectionary reading is like the 18-minute gap Rosemary Woods, Richard Nixon's secretary, was said to have made in one of the Watergate tapes. It's submitted as if it were an embarrassment. I mean, look, what kind of God would do such a thing? Uzzah is an innocent servant. He just reached out like any of us would without a thought. What do we make of this kind of story in the 21st century? I mean, we can easily get hung up by Uzzah's innocent response and dismiss the whole story, like the lectionary writers did, as superstitious nonsense. we might counter that the compassionate heart of God that we know in Jesus would never do such a thing. However, I think if we read the text on its own terms, we might actually come to understand it as an ancient attestation to the incontrovertible holiness of holy things, which is to say that no matter how well-meaning you are, if you reach out to steady a 35,000 kilowatt downed power line, you are going to get fried. Even if you were trying to protect innocent children playing in the area by moving it with your hands, because electricity is electricity, and holy stuff is holy stuff. So this story does us the favor of reminding us that God is not some good old boy, not some pit bull that we can domesticate as it passes into old age. Annie Dillard once famously wrote the following. She said, "If we really knew what the real God of the universe was capable of, we in the church would give people crash helmets and signal flares when they come in the door on Sunday morning. We would strap people in their pews." Okay, now let's agree that if God exists and God is God, then God is everywhere. We read that little piece from Richard Rohr, which I really loved. To come to church, then, is to take part in an exercise in which we all seek corporately, right, to recognize God's omnipresence in this one particular dedicated space. But do we behave as if that's the case? Sometimes, during our corporate prayer time, of course, and surely when we celebrate what we call Holy Communion. Now, I want to confess, though, that sometimes I, as a minister, get so focused on what should happen next in the series of things we do in a service that I lose track of the fact that we are engaging in holy worship. Some churches do a better job with this than we do. For instance, in Russia, it's not unusual to see Orthodox Christians pause in the middle of the sidewalk to look up at a nearby church when it comes into view blocks away. They cross themselves, these Orthodox Christians, and they bow. And after walking somewhat closer, another block, they repeat these actions. And when they reach the doors of the church, they repeat them again 3 times. So there really is no such thing as arriving late to church in the Orthodox tradition, unless you're the priest. You take your time, all the time in the world, as long as you're entering God's house with reverence. You know, after this shocking incident with the ark, David himself parked the god-awful thing outside of Jerusalem for several months just to be safe. So terrified was he of it. Holy terror. Looking back, I've had 2 brushes with what I would call the holy. They both frightened me to my core. I don't think I've ever even spoken about this. First was in 1999 when I visited Israel. I went to a dozen purported holy sites the first week there. Some were just tourist traps. A few interested me intellectually, knowing the background. Going to Capernaum, though, the tiny hamlet that Jesus adopted as his adult home, I was really moved, because you could easily imagine him right there, moving about on those 2 or 3 tiny streets that made up that town. But late in the trip, we went to Jerusalem, where we visited, among other things, the ancient church of the Holy Sepulchre. We wanted to see something really amazing. We waited in line to see the place tradition insists that Jesus was buried. But instead of feeling authentic, it seemed to me to be just another marble shrine. Waiting in line there, though, I spied the huge gray-green rock outcropping, huge, I mean huge, inside that huge church that archaeologists tell us was the place where Romans crucified their enemies. And when I eventually approached it, I was possessed by a peculiar growing terror that I had never encountered ever before anywhere. It came out of nowhere for me. I had to force myself to go to the spot. There was this awesome, intense, terrifying energy that I could not shake, not until sometime after I left that ancient building. I cannot account for it at all. It was just awesome. The closest thing to that experience I've had since was actually in nature. I was about to walk into a grove of redwoods along the Avenue of the Giants near Garberville, California. A lot of you have been there. I pulled off the road at a place called the Bowling Grove. I was not at all prepared for my own reaction at that moment to those 300-foot monster trees. I was petrified, in fact. That seemed strange to me. It wasn't their height exactly. It was their immense width at the base. Those trees are just too big. I know now and knew then that it was just pretty irrational to think that way, but the scale of those trees in that grove just went through me like electricity, and I just wanted to stay by my car. But there was this large boulder with a greenish copper marker on it in the middle of the grove, and I made myself go to look at it, which wasn't easy. It read, "Preserved to the memory of Colonel Reynolds C. Bowling, the first American of his rank to die in the World War. Had this grove not been preserved, these trees would not be here today. This grove of redwoods was set aside in 1928 in an effort to preserve an America worth fighting for." The place was just holy. I don't know how else to put it. Holy and awesome. So let me ask, where are your holy places? Do you have any experiences where you just felt thunderstruck? Or terribly scared, maybe? Or strangely elevated? And let me ask this, has that ever been tied to something overtly religious? Maybe you've encountered specific objects that moved you in an unearthly way. On my final Sunday at the first church I ever served, this was back in 1994, we celebrated communion. I asked the worship committee if I could use a special dish and cup and cross for that service, a set of elements we didn't use all the time, and they said, of course. The dish and cup and cross weren't really much to look at. They were very plain. They'd once been in the care of a pastor friend of mine who's a generation older than me, who had served as an army chaplain in World War II. John McDonald, that was his name, had special duty near the end of that war. He'd been attached to a company that entered the first death camp in Europe to be liberated. After taking stock of the horrors there, he had offered communion to service personnel who had liberated that place, men who had seen unspeakable things. He offered them communion in the open air from the hood of his Jeep using that nondescript Army-issue brass dish and cup and cross. They were as plain can be, but they were, for my money, and still are the holiest objects I have ever had the privilege of using to offer my brothers and sisters the body and blood of Jesus. Among my last words to those in that church on that final morning with them were, "Don't ever forget where these have been, nor whom they have fed." I'm talking about ritual now, right? It's a word that's fallen on hard times, but I think it's still a very meaningful concept. And I say this because we Presbyterians are rather impoverished when it comes to ritual, right? You know, I'm old enough to remember the gift given us by Jacqueline Kennedy in November of 1963 through the funeral that she personally arranged for her husband, President Kennedy. He died on a Friday, and it was a long, torturous weekend. In the wake of an act of unspeakable sadness and loss, she, the widow, created something much more than a funeral. She put together a series of acts of worship, a spectacle for the nation that was incredibly meaningful. It wasn't just about her husband. The ritual she created treated the occasion and the office of the presidency with such honor that it became something of sublime beauty. There were caissons and drums, which gave the funeral parade a depth of solemnity we have not seen since. Who could ever forget the riderless horse with a single boot mounted backward in the stirrup? It was stunning, and the television commentators treated it all with long, silent pauses as it deserved. The whole thing went back not merely to Abraham Lincoln's funeral, which was the primary model that Mrs. Kennedy used. It went back to Roman times. Now, why was it so powerful? Well, in ritual, there is available a sense of comfort that we can find nowhere else. In ritual, I think our heart recognizes its true home. In the winter that followed President Kennedy's funeral, a hamster of mine died. My elementary school friends and I held a state funeral for him in my backyard in California. There was an element of humor in it, of course. It was a hamster, for heaven's sake. And I owned a plastic trumpet, and I learned to play taps on it. Wasn't hard. As my friends carried the rodent to its final resting place, her, I don't know if it was a boy or a girl, in a small coffin-shaped cardboard box, I played taps. And then after the burial, one of us lit a votive candle, which we placed on a brick, which sat just above that little bit of earth. And in that moment, a dozen of us children, I'm guessing about a dozen, stood silently. We were all of us transported to Arlington Cemetery, to the president's grave. We stood there, I don't know how long, gazing at the eternal flame. Something in it must have been healing for children. And children love ritual. When the kids come in and out of worship here, that's a big thing for me. They take to it so naturally. There's something in ritual that touches us at a level deeper than any words can. The Sufi poet Rumi once said, "In true ritual, we fall into the place where everything is music." "Do this in remembrance of me," said Jesus. The way we commune with God and one another in church is through this deeply intimate act that invokes body and blood. We break something. We take something into ourselves. We become one with it. And with that, we ourselves partake of holy mystery, whatever that amounts to. Amen.